Chapter 20. The journey from our town to the metropolis was a journey of about 5 hours. It was a little past midday when the 4-horse stagecoach by which I was a passenger got into the ravel of traffic frayed out about the Cross Keys, Wood Street, Cheapside, London. We Britons had at that time particularly settled that it was treasonable to doubt our having or being the best of everything. Otherwise, while I was scared by the immensity of London, I think I might have had some faint doubts whether it wasn't rather ugly, crooked, narrow, and dirty. Mr. Jaggers had duly sent me his address. It was Little Britain, and he'd written after it on his card, just out of Smithfield, close by the coach office. Nevertheless, a hackney coachman, who seemed to have as many capes on his greasy greatcoat as he was years old, packed me into his coach and hemmed me in with a folding and a jingling barrier of steps, as if he were going to take me 50 miles. His getting on the box, which I remember to have been decorated with an old weather-stained pea-green blanket, moth-eaten into rags, it was quite a work of time. It was a wonderful equipage with 6 great coronets outside and ragged things behind, for I don't know how many footmen to hold on by, and a barrier below them to prevent amateur footmen from yielding to the temptation. I had scarcely had time to enjoy the coach and to think how like a straw yard it was, and yet how like a rag shop, and to wonder why the horses' nose bags were kept inside, when I observed the coachman beginning to get down, as if he were going to stop presently. And stop presently he did, in a gloomy street, at certain offices with an open door, whereupon was painted Mr. Jaggers. "How much?" I asked the coachman. The coachman answered, "1 shilling, unless you want to make it more." I naturally said I had no wish to make it more. "Then it must be 1 shilling, observed the coachman. "I don't want to get you into trouble. I know him." He darkly closed an eye at Mr. Jaggers' name and shook his head. When he had got his shilling, and had in course of time completed his ascent on his box, and had got away, which appeared to relieve his mind, I went into the front office with my little portmanteau in my hand and asked, was Mr. Jaggers at home?
"No, he's not," returned the clerk. "He is in court at present. Am I addressing Mr. Pip?"
I signified that he was addressing Mr. Pip.
"Mr. Jaggers left word would you wait in his room. He couldn't say how long he might be having a case on, but it stands to reason, his time being very valuable, he won't be longer than he can help."
With those words, the clerk opened a door and ushered me into an inner chamber at the back. Here we found a gentleman with one eye, in a velveteen suit and knee breeches, who wiped his nose with his sleeve on being interrupted in the perusal of the newspaper.
"Go and wait outside, Mike," said the clerk.
I began to say that I hoped I was not interrupting, when the clerk shoved this gentleman out with as little ceremony as I have ever seen, tossing his fur cap after him, and I was left alone. Mr. Jaggers' room was lighted by a skylight only, and was a most dismal place. The skylight eccentrically pitched like a broken head, and the distorted adjoining houses looking as if they'd twisted themselves to peep down at me through it. There weren't so many papers about, as I should have expected to see, and there were some odd objects that I should not have expected to see, such as an old rusty pistol, a sword in a scabbard, several strange-looking boxes and packages, and 2 dreadful casts on a shelf of faces peculiarly swollen and twitchy about the nose. Mr. Jagger's own high-backed chair was deadly black horsehair, with rows of brass nails around it like a coffin, and I fancied I could see how he leant back on it and bit his forefinger at his clients. The room was but small, and the clients seemed to have had a bad habit of backing up against the wall especially opposite Mr. Jagger's chair, being greasy with shoulders. I recalled, too, that the one-eyed gentleman had shuffled forth against the wall when I was the innocent cause of his being turned out. I sat down in the cliental chair placed over against Mr. Jagger's chair, and became fascinated by the dismal atmosphere of the place. I called to mind that the clerk had the same air of knowing something about everyone's disadvantage as his master did. I wondered how many other clerks there were upstairs, and whether they all claimed to have the same detrimental mastery of their fellow creatures. I wondered what was the history of all the odd litter about the room, and how it came there. I wondered whether the 2 swollen plaster faces were of Mr. Jagger's family, and, if he was so unfortunate as to have a pair of such ill-looking relations, why he stuck them on the dusty perch for the soot and the flies to settle on, instead of giving them a place at home. Of course, I had no experience of a London summer day, and my spirits may have been oppressed by the hot, exhausted air, and by the dust and grit that lay on thickly on everything. But I sat wondering and waiting in Mr. Jagger's close room until I could hardly bear the 2 casts on the shelf above, and so I got up and walked out. When I told the clerk that I would take a turn in the air while I was waiting, he advised me to go round the corner and I should come into Smithfield. So I came into Smithfield, the great meat market. And the shameful place was all a smear with filth and fat and blood and foam, which seemed to stick at me. So I rubbed it off with all possible speed by turning into a street where I saw the great black dome of St. Paul's bulging at me from behind a grim stone building with a bystander standing against the wall. He told me it was Newgate Prison. Following the wall of the prison, I found the roadway covered with straw to deaden the noise of passing vehicles, and from this, and from the quantity of people standing about, smelling strongly of spirits and beer, I inferred that the trials were on. While I looked about me here, an exceedingly dirty and partially drunk Minister of Justice asked me if I would like to step in and hear a trial or so, informing me that he could get me a front place for £half-a-crown, whence I should command a full view of the Lord Chief Justice in his wig and robes, mentioning that awful person like a waxwork, and presently offering them at the reduced price of 18 pence. As I declined the proposal on the plea of an appointment, he was so good as to take me into a yard and show me where the gallows were kept, and also where people were publicly whipped. And he showed me the debtor's door, out of which culprits came to be hanged, heightening the interest of that dreadful portal by giving me to understand that 4 on 'em would come out at that very door the day after tomorrow at 8 in the morning, to be hanged in a row. This was horrible, and gave me a sickening idea of London. The more so as the Lord Chief Justice's proprietor wore, from his hat down to his boots and up again to his pocket handkerchief inclusive, mildewed clothes which evidently had not belonged to him originally, and which, I took it into my head, he had bought cheap from the executioner. Under these circumstances, I thought myself well rid of him for a shilling. I dropped into the office to ask if Mr. Jaggers had come in yet, and I found he had not. So I strolled out again. This time I made the tour of Little Britain and turned into Bartholomew Close. And now I became aware that other people were waiting for Mr. Jaggers, as well as I. There were two men of secret appearance lounging in Bartholomew Close, and thoughtfully fitting their feet into the cracks of the pavement as they talked together, one of whom said to the other, when they first passed me, that
Jaggers would do it if it was to be done.
There was a knot of 3 men and 2 women standing at a corner, and one of the women was crying on her dirty shawl, and the other comforted her by saying, as she pulled her own shawl over her shoulders,
Jaggers is for him. Melia, what more could you have?
These testimonies to the popularity of my guardian made a deep impression upon me, and I admired and wondered more than ever. At length, as I was looking out at the iron gate of Bartholomew Close into Little Britain, I saw Mr. Jaggers coming across the road towards me. All the others who were waiting saw him at the same time, and there was quite a rush at him. Mr. Jaggers, putting a hand on my shoulder and walking me on his side, without saying anything to me, addressed himself to his followers. First, he took the 2 secret men.
Now, I have something to say to you, said Mr. Jaggers, throwing his finger at them. I want to know no more than I know. As to the result, it's a toss-up. I told you that. I told you that at first. It was a toss-up. Have you paid Wemmick?
We made the journey up this morning, sir, to pay him,
said one of the men submissively, while the other perused Mr. Jaggers' face.
I don't mean to ask what journey you made or when you were going to make it up. All I want to know, is has Wemmick got it?
Yes, sir,
said both of the men together. Very well, then, you may go.
Now, I won't have it,
said Mr. Jaggers, waving his hand at them to put them behind him.
If you say another word to me, I'll throw up the case.
We thought, Mr. Jaggers,
said one of the men, pulling his hat off.
That is what I told you not to do. You thought? I think for you. That's enough for you. If I want you, I know where to find you. I don't want you to find me. Now, I won't have it. I won't hear another word.
The 2 men looked at one another as Mr. Jaggers waved them behind him, and humbly fell back, and were heard no more.
And now you,
said Mr. Jaggers, suddenly stopping and turning on the 2 women with shawls, from whom the 3 men had meekly separated.
Oh, Amelia, is it?
Yes, Mr. Jaggers.
And do you remember, retorted Mr. Jaggers, that but for me you wouldn't be here and couldn't be here?
Oh, yes, sir,
exclaimed both women together.
Lord bless you, sir, we know that.
"Then why," said Mr. Jaggers, "do you come here?"
"My bill, sir,"
the crying woman pleaded. "Now, let me tell you what," said Mr. Jaggers, "once for all. If you don't know that your bill's in good hands, I do know it. And if you come here bothering about your bill, I'll make an example of both you and your bill, and let him slip through my fingers. Have you paid Wemmick?"
"Oh, yes, sir, every farthing."
"Well, then, you've done all you have to do. Say another word, one single word, and Wemmick will give you your money back." This terrible threat caused the two women to fall off immediately. My guardian and I reached the office without further ado.
"Here's Mike,"
said the clerk, getting down from his stool and approaching Mr. Jaggers confidentially. "Oh," said Mr. Jaggers, turning to the man who was pulling a lock in the middle of his forehead like the bull in Cock Robin, pulling at the bell rope. "Your man comes this afternoon. Yes?"
Well, Mr. Jaggers,"
returned Mike in the voice of a sufferer from a constitutional cold.
After a deal of trouble, I did find one, sir, as might do."
"What is he prepared to swear?"
Well, Mr. Jaggers," said Mike, wiping his nose on his fur cap this time, "in a general way, he'll swear anything you like." Mr. Jaggers suddenly became most irate.
"Now, I warned you before," said he, throwing his forefinger at the terrified client, "that if you ever presumed to talk to me in that way here, I would make an example of you. You infernal scoundrel! How dare you talk to me like that?" The client looked scared, but bewildered too, as if he were unconscious of what he'd done.
"You stupid idiot,"
said the clerk in a low voice, giving him a stir with his elbow.
"You soft head. Need you say it face to face?"
"Now I'll ask you again, you blundering booby," said my guardian very sternly, "once more and for the last time, what the man brought you here is prepared to swear." Mike looked hard at my guardian as if he were trying to learn a lesson from his face, and slowly replied,
As to character, or having been in his company and never left him all night in question."
"Now, be careful. In what station of life is this man?" Mike looked at his cap, and looked at the floor, and looked at the ceiling, and looked at the clerk, and even looked at me, before beginning to reply in a nervous manner.
"Well, we've dressed him up like—"
when my guardian blustered out, "What? You will you?"
"Oh, you stupid idiot,"
added the clerk again, with another stir. After some helpless casting about, Mike brightened and began again.
He's dressed like a specklebone pieman, a sort of pastry cook."
"Is he here?" asked my guardian.
I left him," said Mike, "a sitting on some doorsteps just round the corner."
"Take him past this window and let me see him." The window indicated was the office window. We all three went to it behind the wire blind, and presently saw the client go by in an accidental manner with the most murderous-looking tall individual in a short suit of white linen and a paper cap. This guileless confectioner was not by any means sober, and he had a black eye in the green stage of recovery which was painted over.
"Tell him to take his witness away directly," said my guardian to the clerk, in extreme disgust, "and ask him what he means by bringing such a fellow as that."
My guardian then took me into his own room, and while he lunched standing from a sandwich box and a pocket flask of sherry, he seemed to bully his very sandwich as he ate it, informed me of what arrangements had been made for me. I was to go to Barnard's Inn, to young Mr. Pocket's rooms, where a bed had been sent in for my accommodation, and I was to remain with young Mr. Pocket until Monday. On Monday I was to go with him to his father's house on a visit, that I might try how I liked it. Also, I was told what my allowance was to be. It was very liberal, and had handed to me from one of my guardian's drawers the cards of certain tradesmen with whom I was to deal for all kinds of clothes and other such things as I would need. "You'll find your credit good, Mr. Pip," said my guardian, whose flask of sherry smelt like the whole full task, as he hastily recovered himself. "But I shall by no means be unhasty in checking your bills. I shall do that in order to pull you up if I find you outrunning the constable and getting into debt. Of course, you'll go wrong somehow, but that's no fault of mine." After I had pondered a little over this encouraging sentiment, I asked Mr. Jaggers if I could send for a coach. He said it wasn't worth while, as I was very near my destination, and Wemmick would walk round with me if I was pleased. I then found that Wemmick was the clerk in the next room. Another clerk was rung down from upstairs to take his place when he was out, and I and he walked out into the street after shaking hands with my guardian. We found a new set of people lingering outside, but Wemmick made a way through them by saying coolly but decisively,
"I tell you it's no use. He won't have a word to say to any of you."
And we soon got clear of them and went on side by side.